day, everyone. We are Group 3, and today we'll be reporting on chapters 1 to 4 of Jeremy Bentham's book entitled An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Before we begin, however, let us first go through the general outline of this report, or the topics that we will be discussing later on. As you can observe in the slide presented, we'll first discuss Chapter 1 of the Principle of Utility, followed by Chapter 2 of Principles Adverse to that of Utility, then Chapter 3 of the 4 Sanctions of Sources of Pain and Pleasure, and lastly Chapter 4, Value of a Lot of Pleasure or Pain, How to be Measured. With this, we hope you sit back, relax, and listen as we go through these topics together.
We're going to discuss about Chapter 1 of the Principles of Utility. Jeremy Bentham states that mankind is governed by two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do and what we shall do. In other words, pain and pleasure stand above all other consideration and have a fundamental role in human life. Basically, the approval and disapproval of an action is based on the amount of pain or pleasure it will bring. Principle of utility promotes an action that can bring the most amount of happiness. Also, Bentham's principle of utility equates good with pleasure and evil with pain. So if your action brought you pleasure or happiness, then it is good, and if it brought you pain, then it is bad or evil. In Bentham's point of view, the principle of utility can be applied to whole communities. Any act should always intend to achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. The goal of the principle of utility is to achieve well-being or happiness. The actions that produce the most amount of happiness is the most moral. That's why people commend an action that tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good or happiness, or prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness.
The chapter 2 is of principles adverse to that of utility. This chapter reviews about Jeremy Bentham's claims on the theory of morality, which is utilitarianism. First point is the principle of utility. To state it is to confute it. First off, to define this principle in simpler terms, the principle of utility states the actions or behaviors are good if they foster happiness or pleasure, and bad if they tend to cause misery or suffering. If the principle of utility is the right principle to be governed by, then whatever principle that contradicts it in any case must necessarily be complete or partial, so perhaps to state any principle is to confute it thereafter. Second is the principle of asceticism. It is the inverse of the principle of utility. So any philosophy that directly opposes the principle of utility is asceticism, which is a self-denial of indulgence that can involve renouncement of worldly possessions and fasting. For example, the Buddhists believe that attachment to people, material possessions, etc. result in a cycle of increasing unfulfilled desires that cause suffering. According to that philosophy, the denial of worldly conveniences is a path to happiness. Next to be discussed is Epicurean, which is a form of union between parties of the moralists and religionists that a man would not always know which of them influenced him the most, and they would frequently serve to reinforce and enliven one another. Epicureans believe that nature appears to command humans to avoid the pain, and that all animals strive to avoid pain to the greatest extent possible. Epicureans had a very particular idea of what was the greatest pleasure, and their ethics were centered on avoiding suffering rather than seeking pleasure. For the misapplication of a principle of utility, when a man tries to defy this principle, he does so with justifications derived from the principle itself, without even realizing it. So his arguments, if they prove anything, show that the principle is not erroneous, but that it is misapplied in the applications he assumes are made of it. Bentham discussed this by acknowledging that some religious ascetics are working toward their otherworldly rewards, which he calls the principle of utility misapplied. The next important point from this chapter that will be discussed is the principle of sympathy and antipathy. Bentham defined this as the dependence on feelings for moral decisions. It determines if an action is right or wrong based on how we feel about it, our intuition, or our conscience. Since our feelings are not objective, they tend to be inconsistent and involve emotional application. Hence, such principle would make criminal punishment arbitrary and unjust. Next, from this chapter, it was stated that the principle of utility may be pursued consistently, and it is claimed that the more consistently it is pursued, the better it must be for humankind. Any human being has never and will never continuously follow the principle of asceticism. If only 1/10 of the world's population pursues it relentlessly, it will all be reduced into hellhole. And this is simply because the asceticism opposes the natural influences of pleasure and pain. For the theological principle, Bentham addresses what he called the theological principle, the obtainment of divine guidance. He argues that humans cannot know the will of God because written documents require too much interpretation, and we cannot know which interpretation is correct without already having the answer as a basis for comparison. And for the question, do the ends justify the means? Bentham argues that judging actions based on their motive is faulty. It stems from his observation that particular reasons frequently lead to positive utility. So as a result, we form an incorrect conclusion in assessing behavior based on its motives rather than its utility. Nature has placed mankind under the government of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. As Bentham went on to clarify, accounting for immunity from pain, pleasure is the only good and pain is the only evil without exception. As a result, pain and pleasure are the prime cause and consequence of individual actions as well as the efficient cause and motive of individual happiness. Pleasure and pain, according to him, dictate not just how people act but also how they ought to act. In relation to Bentham's principle of utility, to summarize, it states that it recognizes the fundamental role of pain and pleasure in human life. It approves and disapproves an action on the basis of the amount of pain or pleasure brought about. It equates good with pleasure and evil with pain, and it asserts that pleasure and pain are capable of quantification or to be measured. Thank you so much.
The third chapter of Bentham's book is entitled Of the Four Sanctions or Sources of Pain and Pleasure. Pain and pleasure are important factors that affect and determine human acts. These two things should be taken into consideration by legislators when making laws, with the main goal of promoting the happiness of the individuals in a society. But the question is, how will the legislator deter people from engaging in unjust conduct that will lead to pain and drive them to conform to the law or moral rules that will most probably lead to general happiness or pleasure? This can be done through sanctions or a sanctioning system. In this chapter, Bentham identified four distinguishable sources from which pleasure and pain are in use to flow. These are the physical, political, moral or popular, and religious sanctions. First is the physical sanction, which is the physical consequences of an action which happens due to the ordinary course of nature. Therefore, it is without human or supernatural intervention. For example, in the case of cigarette smokers, knowing the fact that smoking can cause cancer and increase their risk for tuberculosis, this may be a sanction or motive limiting the times that they smoke, or it can also encourage them to quit smoking. Next, political sanction, which means a legal sanction or punishment artificially attached by law to certain actions. For instance, there is a law in the Philippines punishing those who violate quarantine protocols. The offender can either be fined or imprisoned, or both. By moral or popular sanction, it had its source in the opinion of the public, that is, the inconveniences a person may experience by engaging in acts that are disapproved by the public, such as being disrespectful to others. This can negatively affect how the public views the person involved in such an act. Meanwhile, it is a religious sanction if it is a penalty from the immediate hand of a supernatural or superior invisible being. The pleasures and pains belonging to each are capable of giving a binding force to any law or rule of conduct. Therefore, sanctions can be seen in a retributive manner based on how Bentham explained how these sanctions work in regulating human conduct. To explain further, as Bentham previously stated, the goodness or badness of an act is established mainly by its consequences. It can either cause pain or pleasure to oneself and to other persons involved in the performed act. As such, sanctions can serve as a threat to discourage people from engaging in unwanted acts, or it may create a motivation for them to conform to the rules made by the legislator.
Now we proceed to Chapter 4, Value of a Lot of Pleasure or Pain, How to be Measured. The chapter begins with Jeremy Bentham explaining that seeking pleasure and avoiding pain is a primal desire in humans, an instinct, if you will. We do not know the exact reasons as to why we do it, but nevertheless we go through with it as it is a part of our nature. Given this desire, we are compelled to understand their force, or in other words, their value. This particular circumstance inspired Bentham to devise an algorithm known as the hedonic or philosophic calculus that can determine the moral rightness of an action by calculating the amount of pain and pleasure it can produce. The calculus overall consists of 7 criteria, but this number changes depending on the context in which an action is evaluated. To elaborate, the value of pleasure or pain for an individual for one event is determined by the following criteria, namely intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, and propinquity or remoteness. In the case where the one being given value is an act or particular action, 2 more considerations are added to the list, namely fecundity and purity. Likewise, when the situation that needs to be given value of involves a group or a number of people, 1 more consideration is added to the list, and this is known as the extent. But what do these criteria mean exactly? Let us explore that idea in the next slide. The first criteria is known as intensity. This is how intense the pleasure or pain is. You can think of it as asking yourself the question, how happy would I be, or how happy would people be if the certain act is done? And likewise, how sad would I be, or how sad would people be if the certain act is done? Naturally speaking, this is just a rough example, and pleasure can translate to other positive emotions as pain can translate to other negative emotions. The second criteria is duration. This is how long the pain or pleasure will last. Is it short-lived? Does it last for a couple hours, days, or months? Or will the pleasure or pain continue to be felt until far off into the future? These are the questions that the second criteria encapsulates. The third one is certainty or uncertainty. This is the guarantee that pain or pleasure will arise from a specific action. Say, for example, you want to perfect a test. How sure are you that fulfilling this act will give you pleasure? Likewise, let's say you want to commit a crime. How sure are you that fulfilling this act will give you pain? These are the kinds of questions that the third criteria seeks to explore. Next is propinquity or remoteness. This is how far in the future the pleasure or pain is. Another way of understanding this is by asking yourself the question, if I do this, how long will it be till I can feel pleasure? Or how long will it be till I can feel the pain? Does it come the instant I'm finished with this act? Or will I have to wait longer in order for me to experience these sensations? The next one is fecundity, or also known as the probability that the pleasure or pain will lead to pleasure or pain of the same kind. Say, for example, you eat a piece of cake and eating it gives you pleasure. Fecundity exists in whether or not you will still feel the same pleasure if you kept eating the cake many times. This, of course, applies in the opposite sense, or rather, if you'll still feel the same pain if you kept doing something repeatedly. Next is purity. This is the probability of the pleasure or pain to not be followed with sensations of the opposite kind. A brilliant way to demonstrate this is to think of a situation where, for example, you throw a rock at someone, or you gave them an insult perhaps. This is just an example, but suppose you felt pleasure from doing so. How sure are you that they won't hit or insult you back, therefore making you feel pain in the process? This is what the criteria of purity encapsulates. Next is extent. This is the number of people who will be affected if a particular action is done. In a way, you can think of it as something like, if I do this, how many people will feel pleasure or pain from it? This is important in the concept of utilitarianism because, as mentioned previously in the first chapter, the action that produces the most happiness is considered the most moral. Aside from the criteria, Bentham also mentioned about the steps to determine the effect of an act on the interests of community. This is already him diving further into the calculus in which he has devised. According to Bentham, we can first start knowing the effect of an act on one person that is immediately affected by it. Once we have selected our person, we need to add four things, namely the value of the direct pleasure, the value of the direct pain, the value of the secondarily pleasurable outcomes, and the value of the secondarily painful outcomes. Like you would in your math problems, add all the pleasure obtained in the situation and subtract all the pain obtained. If the result is positive, or rather if the pleasure surpasses the pain that can be obtained, the act is good for that individual. Likewise, if the result is negative or the pain surpasses the pleasure that can be obtained, the act is bad for that individual. Once you have gathered sufficient information in this aspect, take account of the number of persons affected by the act, and then repeat the same process to determine the overall effect. Naturally, if an act is good for many individuals, then it is morally right. But if an act is bad for many individuals, then it is considered morally wrong. Despite these calculations, Bentham acknowledges or is aware that making formal calculations is not always practical. This is mainly because the entire process itself is time-consuming, and even more so when a large group of people is involved. As such, he stated that it was not necessary to do these computations for every moral judgment. Instead, estimations can be done in order to assess this aspect. He further clarified that pleasure and pain can be evaluated in terms of good, profit, convenience, advantage, benefit, emolument, happiness, and so forth, as well as to evil, mischief, and the like. In defense of his calculus, however, Bentham stated that property has value according to the degree of the pleasure or pain that it affords to the owner, or in other words, an act is valued based on how much pleasure or pain it can bring to an individual. Hence, it is the reason why an act may be more valued in one person than it is in another, as it depends on the circumstances that surround how much sensations they will be able to feel from doing such. To summarize the general point of this chapter, we will relate this once again to the concept of utilitarianism, and I quote, "We must always act so as to produce the greatest good for the greatest number." That is all, and we hope you've learned a lot from this discussion. Thank you all for listening.